Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia Osorio, Executive Director of the National Organization for Women of New York City. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a great program. We're going to be speaking to mayoral candidate Maya Wiley today. The discussion is going to be led by our very own now NYC President, Abby Dobson. We're going to get straight to it. Just one quick reminder. On our website, Now NYC, you can find the questionnaires for all of the mayoral candidates. And we have Ray McGuire coming up to end our series on Thursday at noon, lunchtime. The primary, the early voting starts June 12th. The primary is June 22nd. Write it on your hand. Here we go. I'm turning it over to Abby now. See you at the end.
Hello, New York. I am Abby Dobson, President of Now NYC. We are truly excited to have with us today Maya Wiley, candidate for Mayor of New York City. As Sonia said, please visit our website and check out the questionnaires online. This is a very important decision for a critical and crucial local election. With us today is Maya Wiley. Maya Wiley is a mother, lawyer, professor, and civil rights activist. Maya Wiley served in the Civil Division of the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Before being appointed counsel to Mayor Bill de Blasio, she worked for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the American Civil Liberties Union. Maya has also served as the chairman, or the chairperson rather, of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, CCRB, and was an MSNBC legal analyst. She has also taught at the Milano School of Policy, Management, and Environment. Maya Wiley, welcome. We'd like to start with just a few introductory questions so that people can learn a little bit more about you beyond your policy ideas and policy prescriptions. So, Maya Wiley, tell us about your love for New York City and what this city means to you.
Well, New York City is home, and there's no other city I've ever wanted to live in my entire life. I lived here as a baby in a Mitchell Lama apartment on the Lower East Side because my parents were civil rights activists and my father was working for Congress and racial equality. But I did grow up in Washington, but even then we used to always come back up for his organizing. He was organizing Black women, women of all races who are on welfare for dignity, and that included New York. And I always wanted to be here because everyone was here, and New York had everything. It's the most diverse city, vibrant, and vibrant because 800 languages spoken, and it just felt like a place where we wouldn't be disappeared. I experienced displacement in my Black neighborhood when I was young, and I thought New York would be one of these places where we couldn't be disappeared, and that really was important to me. And I've raised two kids here, 20 and 17, and don't want to live anywhere else. It's just home, and it's the most miraculous place on the planet.
Thanks so much for that. Can you share with us a moment when you faced true adversity in your life, how you overcame it, and how your response to this adversity influences the ability to lead New York City, arguably one of the toughest, greatest, most challenging cities in the world?
I think like so many of us, we all have many different instances of adversity at different times in our lives. I will say that the most significant in my life was watching my father die when I was 9 years old. My brother and I alone with him on a boat, and we had to both deal with the fact of that immediate loss, but we also had to figure out how to get home. And, in the process of trying to figure out how to get home, asking people for help, a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old alone after being on a boat and jumping and swimming to shore, and all these white people on the beach, and no one came to help us. We started knocking on doors. We finally got to a door, I think it was the third door, where a man answered. It was a white man, and he immediately embraced us and called the police. And I say that because, I had this very early trauma, and it was both the trauma of losing my father, which was devastating, but it was also one of the examples, not even my first, of this trauma of knowing that there were adults who would not care for me. And having that sense that kids have that it was because of how I looked. But a lot of the way I overcame it, frankly, was perseverance. Having a mother who was a powerful woman, and frankly, one who was fearless, but also extremely, extremely committed to making sure we addressed our trauma. As a working mom, she ended up quitting her job, and she was already a professional woman, and this was the early 70s, so she had to deal with a lot at work, be a breadwinner for the family, and now deal with some traumatized kids. She quit her job and hung out a shingle from the house, frankly, to be a management consultant, creating and implementing affirmative action policies for government. But as a way that she could also be home with us and be home when we got home from school, even if she was working out of the house, and getting us mental health services and supports. And so, a big part of it was learning that, you have to have help, and you have to have strength, and you have to have some faith and belief in yourself. And that when you have pain and when you have adversity, it is the ability to marshal both every resource you have personally within you, but also every resource you have that you can draw upon outside of and around you. And in a city that has been traumatized, in a city that's facing an historic crisis, and in a city where that crisis also includes race and gender, sexual orientation, all the things that have traditionally been struggles that we've had for really recognizing the value and the equality of all our people, that now this is an incredible both adversity but opportunity to recognize and see all the resources we have to marshal, both in our people and in our resilience, but also in terms of how we have to come together and really be bold and transformational and do things differently, including recognize that we're traumatized as a city, as a state, as a country. And for me, it's both being a policy advocate, but it's also being a person who knows what that feels like and knows what it takes and knows that it's possible.
I totally agree. Do you consider yourself to be a feminist? If so, when did you first realize that you were a feminist?
So I have always been a feminist. I didn't always know the word, but I always knew. And I had a mama and my grandmothers who were, and aunts, tough as nails. And when I say tough as nails, I don't mean that they weren't loving and nurturing, but I mean that worked, that held it down, that brought home paychecks, that took care of kids, and that frankly had many more challenges and had to rise to many more occasions than many of the men I knew. But what I always knew was that we were not treated as equal, as powerful, as competent and qualified. I know my mother had to deal when she was one of her jobs, and I was a kid, and I remember these stories. But she was doing an affirmative action program for the Rochester Police Department to help them racially diversify. And she had to walk down into an arena full of police officers, predominantly white men, and they catcalled her the entire walk down to the front of that room, where she had to, after having endured that incredible demeaning experience, had to pull that room, pull their attention, hold it, and tell them what they had to do. And she did. And so, for me, feminism is about the recognition of our personhood, of our possibility, of our power, of our equality. And there has simply never been a time in my life where either my parents or any of the folks they surrounded themselves with ever delivered any other message but that. So I have always been, because I have always been raised to believe in our power.
In a recent poll we conducted of our members, more than 60% felt that the mayoral candidates were not putting women front and center in their campaigns. How do you plan to put women and girls front and center if elected mayor of New York City? How do you plan to change the landscape for women and girls in the first 4 years of a Wiley administration?
Well, I will say, as a woman and as a Black woman running to be mayor, I have formed my entire platform, one, around recognizing that it has to be a recovery for all of us. That, two, because that's what we don't usually do in a crisis. We recover every time, but we don't recover all of us. But two, I've been the explicit one in this race who has already done that. And I just left this endorsement by Cecile Richards, by Congresswoman Katie Porter yesterday. And a big part of it is because I have made one of my major pillars, platform items for recovering the city equitably, that we recognize that women have lost a decade in this economy, that women have been both pushed out by the pressures upon families that they were primarily responsible to care for, to stay home and help kids struggle through online learning, that we have had 52% of women in this city who have lost hours or jobs as a result either of choosing to stay home with kids or because they lost jobs. And in December of this year, I just said this up at our announcement, in December of 2020, when we were celebrating as a country that there was a small, ray of hope in a rebounding economy because we had added jobs for the first time, that same month, even though overall we had added jobs, women had lost over 100, and I think it was 156,000 jobs at a time when we were celebrating an increase in jobs. And that women in the care economy in particular, care work is unpaid labor, and it's also a labor market, fast growing, but where predominantly women, in fact, predominantly women of color, and where it is not work that is valued sufficiently, either in terms of pay or benefits or priority. And so what I proposed as part of the recovery is the creation of both care grants, so $5,000 grants for the neediest families to care for themselves. We know that that's far too often single women with children, and that will include people who are undocumented. You will not have to have papers to qualify for those grants, but also the creation of universal care centers, drop-off centers for child care, for elder care, for care for family members with disabilities, because for far too many women, first of all, that will create care jobs. And I'm proud to be endorsed by SEI 1199 SEIU, because we're going to make those union jobs in the care economy and create more jobs for the women who have lost them. But we're also going to recognize that that is about one of the top 3 costs of living, which is child care and elder care, the caring for family members, that it is unpaid, and that for far too many, it is financially out of reach, which is why we're going to create these care centers. They're going to be free drop-off centers so that women can go to the job interview or go to the doctor for a doctor's appointment. I've also included it in my healthcare plan, and we've already put a plan out on maternal health, because we know, particularly if you're a Black woman, we have the highest mortality and morbidity rates in pregnancy and childbirth in the country. And it's an outrageous and shameful number already in this country, but this city, it's 11%. I was fortunate to have midwives and doulas, so I am going to create midwifery centers in every single hospital I, as mayor, have power and control over. But we're also going to create a council that's going to track and create accountability and tracking for all our healthcare around maternal and child health, so that we can identify exactly where and how we have to do better and hold those providers accountable. But look, I've also done it in the form of our New Deal New York plan, where I am going to create 100,000 new jobs. And I've been explicit, one, about those jobs. That's going to be to build things we need built and fix things we need fixed, like more deeply affordable housing, critically important for our, particularly for so many of our families. The city is not livable right now because the rents are too high for too many. but that it's also about making sure we're hiring locally in communities hard hit, including women, including supporting programs like NEW that create construction pathways for women in pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs. But it's also to make sure that we do women and minority-owned business enterprise contracting and get those numbers up, because my own mother was a WBE, and it's how she kept food on our table, but it's a critical part of our economy. And it's also our small businesses, because women are entrepreneurs and our small businesses are half of our jobs. So we're actually going to have both grant programs to help businesses that are hard hit, and including in particular women-owned businesses and hard hit communities, to come back, to clear that back debt, but also to clear the regulatory red tape, so that our businesses can survive and thrive and provide the supports to create more entrepreneurship in our communities, including for women. Now, we've got more trauma-informed care in our schools. I won't go deeply into that because I want to make sure we can get to more questions. But, you know, we know that 1 out of every 4 girls self-harms. That's trauma behavior. And frankly, we are not paying attention to it. And in trauma-informed care in our schools, that is there are forms of therapy that are available that bring those rates down, and also send graduation rates up. So we're going to do that as well. So more to come and more in my plans, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. Your responses have been incredibly thoughtful and expansive. You've pretty much skipped ahead and answered some of the questions that we had for you with regards to recovery for our care workers and the importance of childcare for women dealing with our economy. Another quick question: how do you plan to tackle long-term unemployment in New York City?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, it starts with making this an affordable city. You know, affordability is a growth strategy. So that's why my New Deal New York plan, which is to create more deeply affordable housing and create 100,000 jobs in the process. And that's something I've stress tested with economists. This is not a number we just made up and pulled out of thin air. But it's also a budget I will control as mayor by doubling the size of our capital construction budget to $10 billion. And doing it in ways that are circulating those dollars into our communities that are hard hit by COVID, and into programs and organizing as well. You know, one of the things we have as a city is workforce development dollars, and it's fragmented. It's broken up across, I think there's at least 6 to 10 agencies that have different pools of workforce development dollars. But in this crisis, we have to organize our workforce development around the workforce development we need for our people, particularly those hard hit. So women of all races, particularly women of color in this city, and making sure that we're directing those workforce development dollars in ways that are aligning with both how we as a city are spending and creating jobs, but also how we as a city have growth sectors like life sciences, like tech, deeply, deeply underrepresented in terms of women, like healthcare. So all of these are avenues, and we have other growth areas. So all of these are about aligning our dollars smartly, and also aligning them to actually ensure that we're having the right partnerships with CUNY, because CUNY is an incredibly important resource for us, particularly for low-income communities, and a lot of them low-income communities that are women who are immigrant, women who are low income of all races, and ethnicities. And so, you know, CUNY and that partnership is going to be a big part of that strategy, as well as making sure that we're building our small business and entrepreneurship opportunities. As I said, that's 50% of our jobs. Women are the fastest growing entrepreneurs. A lot of those women are sole proprietors, you know, and so organizing our resources around how we support developing that entrepreneurship is going to be really important.
Great, thank you. We polled our members here at Now NYC, and not surprisingly, housing, safety, education ranked as the top issues for the next mayor. People are moving out of New York City because it just simply isn't affordable anymore for New Yorkers. While this has been exacerbated because of the pandemic, this trend started well before this public crisis. One marker of New York City's increasing unaffordability is reflected in the housing market. Affordable housing is no longer affordable to middle and low income earners in New York City. One member had a question. She says, where is the affordable housing for New York City agency workers who are mainly frontline workers and make $60,000 and below? They can't afford housing on New York Housing Connect, and they're not eligible for Section 8. We service New York City, she says, mainly Black and brown women, and can't afford to live in New York City and work here, assisting everyone else, yet can't afford rents and mortgages or even food. This is the cry of one of our members.
It's not just one, yeah.
Yeah, not just one. So what signature policy are you proposing to significantly increase the affordability of housing in New York City for New York City agency workers and other New York City residents, and what will you do differently from your predecessors?
Well, let me start by saying, one, this is an issue that pulled me and called me into this race. My own kids, who are 20 and 17, are trying to figure out how they can stay in the city of their birth. And they're fairly lucky kids, right? This is absolutely right to say this was a crisis before COVID, and COVID has deepened it. So look, there is no one thing, because the truth is we need a comprehensive strategy that pulls all our resources and all our powers of government. But so let me mention three. So one is my New Deal New York plan, because it's our capital construction budget that is what we utilize as a city to create more affordable housing, except in a Maya Wiley administration, it's going to be deeply affordable. Because you're right, one of the critiques of the current administration and also the administration that came before it was that anything that was called affordable was way out of reach for the average New Yorker. So it's not that we didn't create affordable housing, it's how we defined it.
Correct.
It's how we defined it, and we didn't define it in ways that actually met the needs of so many of our people. So we're going to define it as rent people can actually pay. And that includes, it's one of the primary issues for SEIU 1199 for our nurses, our home health aides. So this is a problem that has to be part of job one. So building more is why I'm doubling the capital construction budget. But look, we also have to get recognize our resources in vacant land. We've got 1,000 acres of vacant land in this city that the city owns. And rather than just selling it off to private developers, we have to see that as our opportunity to have partnerships with not-for-profit housing developers to create 100% permanently affordable housing. That's a resource and a leverage I'm gonna pull. And we have to recognize that we have the power with our zoning laws to actually get the private sector to do more deeply affordable. And I'm gonna use that power as well. So there's more that I will do, including protecting public housing and keeping it public, because that is permanently affordable public housing stock. I'm going to work on that. There are reforms we need in Albany to make sure we're utilizing our resources for protecting currently affordable housing and creating more. So there's also more to do with the state and federal government. But I'm just wanted to name those three things that I can do as mayor and have the power to do, and we'll start doing on day one.
Great, that's good to hear. How long would you extend the eviction moratorium in New York City?
As long as is necessary, because look, we've got 400,000 more New Yorkers facing eviction because of COVID than we did before COVID. We lost over a million jobs in the city. I think we've gotten about 300 and some odd thousand back. But as we know, there's still back rent, so that's an issue as well. But look, in my plan, I put out an eviction moratorium plan back in, I think it was January or February. But it was to balance, because eviction moratorium has to be also about supporting homeowners who are renting. We have a lot of families who own homes, and part of the way they get their mortgage paid is they rent out part of their house, whether it's their basement apartment or a bedroom. And we also have small landlords who are not wealthy people, but they own some buildings and they're small landlords. And it's part of how they keep their families afloat. So in my eviction moratorium, it's not you keep tenants, but you are at risk of losing your home or your building. It's that we take the relief dollars we have coming from the federal government and we create subsidies for the homeowners and the small landlords that say, in exchange for you not evicting your tenant, we will subsidize you so you're still getting paid your rents and you can pay your mortgages, you can pay your taxes. And so that is a balanced approach that recognizes we can't make this homeless crisis a homeless catastrophe because we already had a homeless crisis before COVID, but that there's also a way to do it that ensures that we're not devastating the wealth and the home ownership and the property ownership of folks who are also struggling to support families.
Great. That sounds like a really balanced approach. Housing affordability is impacted by a person's or a family's income and wealth, as we've been talking about. How do you plan to address current levels of poverty in New York City experienced by cash and wealth poor New Yorkers who are often left out of the equation when we talk about policy plans, especially during an election cycle?
Well, this is one of the reasons I have my universal care plan, which is to recognize that we need care grants and to the neediest New Yorkers, and that those grants, by the way, those grants, you use it for what you need it for. If you need it for childcare, you use it for childcare. If you need it for childcare and some food, and making sure you can buy food through the month, that's what you use it for. You need it to help with your rent. We're not going to tell folks what to use the grant for. It's just to support the family. And the second thing is, and bringing costs down like the drop-off centers, because we know that's one of the top costs of living. And if you saw just horrific, the New York Times just put out, I think it was just last night, so it should be in today's paper, the story of an undocumented immigrant woman who had a job in a laundromat that she lost. She lost that job. She has 3 children. And so a big part of what the story is about is how she struggled to live on $100 a month. Crazy. Crazy. And so, but the point is that's happening to so many New Yorkers, including some who work. I know an SEIU worker who's a home health aide who has 40 hours a week work and is lucky because she has a minimum wage job and union protections. She still stands in a food pantry line twice a week. So the care grants really are for the neediest New Yorkers. It is also, though, affordability, right? So this is the affordable housing. It's bringing the cost of living down. I saw that someone in the chat said, what's your vision for New York? What matters for you? My vision for New York is that we remain a diverse and vibrant city because it's livable, because we can afford to be here and live decent lives. That's my vision, but that's why I have all these platform planks that recognize it's housing affordability, being able to pay the rent. It's getting care and support for care. It's getting grants to people who need it. And it's supporting people's ability to generate more livelihoods. But it's also healthcare, which we haven't talked about. We have 600,000 New Yorkers. Healthcare is one of the other top 3 costs of living. And we know we have 600,000 New Yorkers who do not have health insurance. A lot of them are undocumented. A lot of them who are documented are just in a cash economy. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at, and I'm actually working with experts right now around how we use the city's bargaining power, because the city insures over 1 million people when you include city employees and their families, at 1.25 million people. We have a lot of bargaining power, particularly if we come together with our unions, with our large nonprofits like universities, and we start collectively bargaining. But that'll give the city the ability not just to bring prices down on things like prescription drugs and other things as a city, because we have that much bargaining power, but also for the city to start to create, the ability to create some insurance options for folks who don't have insurance. Because once we start looking at those top 3 costs of living and how we provide more supports, we also have to look at how we're bringing down those costs. And that's what I'm going to do as mayor.
Great, thank you for that. Another aspect of livability is, particularly for women, is safety in so different realms. What is your plan to reduce crime and improve safety, and how do you balance this with the clear and undeniable need for meaningful transformation in policing, particularly with respect to combating police brutality and ensuring police accountability?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because it's an important one for me, particularly since I chaired the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, which has oversight of police misconduct, created a criminal justice initiative in post-apartheid South Africa for the Open Society Foundation, which, by the way, had the highest rape rates in the world at the time that we created that initiative. And in New York, one of the things we are not talking enough about, we do talk about the fact that domestic violence has jumped up dramatically during COVID. It's a problem that requires our immediate attention, but it's also rapes. You know, we're not talking about the fact that rapes have jumped up 30% during COVID. So sexual violence, violence against women and sexual violence in particular, huge problems. So I actually put out a plan to balance these things, both in my gun violence prevention plan, which was the first plan I put out because communities of color were saying this is not getting sufficient attention that it deserves, and in my policing plan. So let me tell you what the balance is, because I think you used exactly the right word, which is balance. One is we need to restructure the police department and focus it on the priorities of policing, which is violent crime, but to do it effectively and in partnership, and to actually have community policing throughout the department. Right now, the model of policing, and I call it problem-solving policing, which is also part of community policing, is part of a whole researched approach to policing that's called problem-oriented policing, but it's where you're actually partnering both with other agencies of government and with communities on identifying where and how we have both hotspots, which we do often in terms of where violence is happening and why and how, but it's also about partnering to create more strategies that prevent the violence in the first place. So that's one, but the other is investing in the things that we know bring violence rates down. So we have to make it easier, for example, to get a job than a gun. So I'm going to double the numbers of summer youth employment. We have to recognize that so much of violence is also is about trauma. And so trauma-informed care, I'm going to put trauma-informed care in our schools, as I talked about, but I'm also going to create mental health crisis response. But we're going to create more support services, including how we support community-based organizations. There's actually a Haitian organization of women that works against violence right in central Brooklyn, where I live, that's just endorsed me. But they're also actually doing community-level work on preventing violence against women and on safety. And we have to be investing in those grassroots community-based efforts. It's a big part of what I did in South Africa, too. That actually builds up the capacity of communities to recognize what has to be done and how to prevent violence and how to support survivors and prevent others from becoming survivors. But the third, it's actually connected to all this, but I don't want to lose it because it's so important, is I've got a participatory justice fund. So the communities that are suffering from high rates of violence will actually have, just like we do participatory budgeting, we'll be able to say as government, here are public dollars available to you to direct to what you need as a community, because it's also not a one-size-fits-all depending on the neighborhood, because some neighborhoods have some kinds of programs but not others, or some have programs that desperately need to be expanded upon. We'll be doing a lot of that as government, but we want to put some power in the hands of the people in communities to direct those dollars to what's effective for their communities.
Great, thank you for that. So how do you respond to, all of that is incredibly important, but how do you respond to a survivor who might not feel that a community-driven public safety model will protect women from sexual assault in New York City? Do you have any specific plans for preventing and reducing the occurrence of gender-based violence in New York City, including sexual assault and rape?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there's a role for policing to be smarter, more effective, and more accountable when it comes to crimes that are violent crimes, including sexual violence and violence against women. One of the things that we're going to place in our universal care centers are also how we co-locate with supports. But, you know, look, policing is not smart enough right now or effective enough because it doesn't have those partnerships. And too often, as we've seen, it is not sufficiently responsive. So the partnerships actually matter a lot. That's also focusing the police on the priorities.
Mhm.
As you know, the NYPD puts up on its data where there have been incidents of rape, for example. But we know that so much of it goes unreported. So so the issue we have isn't that we don't need policing and isn't that we don't deploy that policing in smart, effective ways, but in the absence of building up the partnerships, what we will have, frankly, is what we have right now, which is insufficient visibility because so many women don't come forward. And that's why we actually need to have the balanced approach that has the right role for policing, but also making sure we've also balanced it with how many women need support and services but don't come forward and report the crime.
Great, thank you for that. We are a year out from the awful occurrence, the death of George Floyd, uh, the deaths of so many other Black and Brown individuals. What would your most important police reform or transformation would be if elected mayor of New York City? You've addressed a couple, but what would be your signature or most
Well,
important
look,
police reform?
first of all, thank you. And first of all, let me be very explicit and clear. I am going to have mayoral control of the New York City Police Department. I'm going to take charge of it. It has always reported, the police commissioner has always reported to the mayor. We have not always had, though, someone who takes charge of the police department because it is supposed to protect and serve the people of the city of New York, but it can't do that if it remains unaccountable. So in addition to all the things I've said, I'm going to have a civilian police commissioner that does not come up through the rank and file of the New York City Police Department, and that is on mission for transforming the police department so that it is fair and just and reorganized in a way that really makes it much smarter and much more effective while abiding by the constitutional rights of the people of the city of New York and recognizing the role of protection and service and making it community policing and problem solving focused. But that also means creating a different accountability structure. So I'm going to create a civilian commission that sits on top of the police department, and that is the policy making, priority setting, rule making, and disciplinary decision maker for the police department. That's important because we don't have that right now. The police commissioner makes disciplinary decisions for the New York City, for our, as we call them, members of service, the uniformed officers. And what we need is civilian decision making there, but it is both on after misconduct happens, but it's also about reorienting the department's priorities and the rules of the road so that it is clear what is and is not okay to do. And this model exists. Camden, New Jersey did this. They created an 18-page excessive force policy, made it very clear what officers could and could not do. Typically what happens is police unions argue for broad discretion. What broad discretion gets us is a lack of accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And what very clear rules and rule setting gets us is clarity. And in Camden, which is a low income, largely Black and Latino city, they've all but eliminated police violence by creating that clarity. And it also makes it's fair to the police officers because they know the rules of the road more clearly, but it also creates for more accountability when they go off-roading. Because there's less gray area. But we need a civilian voice that's going to take into account all sides and have a public process, but set those rules of the road, not have the police department set them.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful responses. I know that you have to run, you are busy running for mayor of New York, but just one other quick thing. Tell us, you are a transformation candidate. You are talking about transforming leadership for New York City. How do you get beyond your strong experienced leadership and effective management? How do you plan to inspire New Yorkers to reimagine and transform the city with you?
You know, that's such a great question. And what I find it all over the city, because I'm I'm very grateful that we are now getting across the city, but we've also did it in the context of this campaign by holding people's assemblies where folks could come, did not have to support or endorse me to participate. We did not ask for that. It was a listening session that gave people the ability to come and discuss what their problems, priorities, ideas, and innovations are. And the thing about New Yorkers is they're just dying for someone to say, come on, let's figure it out together. This isn't going to be just a top-down government, because that's not the way we roll. This is about us all coming. It's an all hands on deck moment. So I've got big transformational ideas. We're going to implement them. They're what people are asking for. We develop them out of a collective process in our people's assemblies, in talking to people who are impacted. But that's also how I'm going to lead government. And I'm going to be frank and say I think it's a big part of how women lead and how we lead differently, because it is a collective process. It is opening up government to say, we're listening and we're hearing, and we're going to partner as government at finding the solutions people are coming up with and building them up from the ground up, identifying where and how people have priorities we might be missing, but calling folks together to say, this is what we do best as New Yorkers. This is why we come out of crises every single time. Our challenge now isn't whether we'll come out of this crisis. It's whether we will fix what is broken and that has been broken before this crisis, and this crisis fast track. And that's the call. And I haven't talked to a New Yorker yet, whether Black with a single parent with young kids and struggling to make ends meet, or an undocumented immigrant that's cutting lawns, or frankly, you know, a Wall Street lawyer with a big bank account. But I don't hear anybody arguing for a status quo. I think the discussion is how we do it, not what we need to achieve, but how we do it. And so what we need is a leadership that calls us together and invites folks to the table and says, I'm setting a table for all of us so we can all sit down and eat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maya Wiley, for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for doing this. And I look forward to working with all of you.
Wonderful.
Take care. Be safe and well.
Take care. And now I'd like to pass it over to our Deputy Director, Jean Beccaria, who has some important information that she wishes to share with our members to help you make your decision, again, this critical decision about who will become the next mayor of New York City. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone, for this great conversation. It's just so important. I think you get a completely different perspective on all the candidates when you have the chance to actually hear from them in a one-on-one setting. So we hope you enjoyed our interview series. If you missed any of our interviews, you can go to our website, nownyc.org, and you can see recordings of all the interviews that we've done, and we will be uploading this recording as well. So you can take a look at that. You can review all the candidate questionnaires, and you can also look at our Compare the Candidates link, where you can check out your favorite questions and see how all the different candidates answered those questions. Just very quickly, I'd love to just point out that if you want to be first to get our endorsements, if you want to hit the road with us in our Get Out the Vote efforts for the candidates that we support, we ask that you please consider becoming a Now New York City member. You could sign up nownyc.org/member. We'd love for you to do that. You can support for as little as $20, and it's just so important as we try to get more women's voices heard and get more women elected to office to lead our city. Very next, I just want to end on the fact that we have Ray McGuire this Thursday at noon. This will be our final interview in our series. And just some quick reminders of the dates that Sonia spoke about at the beginning of our meeting today. Remember, it is actually this Friday is your last chance to register to vote in this primary that's so important. We have a lot of races to consider, city council, borough presidents, but I think, and of course the mayor, which is really critical for how our city recovers post-pandemic and whether or not we are putting women front and center. Remember, early voting starts June 12th. and runs through June 20th. So that's right around the corner. And Election Day is the 22nd. So we're going to keep sharing information with you, keep you informed, and we thank you so much for joining us today. So we hope you have a great day. And thanks, and we hope to see you on Thursday.